Planet Institute.
Intelligence. Human intelligence, emotional intelligence, creative intelligence, collective intelligence, artificial intelligence. I could go on. Perhaps that list tells us something important. In our attempts to understand intelligence better, we have learned to break it apart, to name it, classify it, measure it, and increasingly to control it. But in doing so, we may have missed a more unsettling question. Not what intelligence is, but who or what we are allowing to think on our behalf. This is not a new anxiety. It runs through modernity. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley describes the moment when Victor Frankenstein finally succeeds in animating the being he has labored over for years. The science works. The body moves, the eyes open, and yet, in the very moment of success, the dream collapses into horror. The creature lives, or at least has the semblance of life, but its creator cannot bear to look at it. Shelley's warning is not against knowledge, it is against unreflected progress, against the creation of power without the cultivation of responsibility. A century and a half later, popular culture found a similar note. In 1981, on their album Time, Electric Light Orchestra sang, "Though you ride on the wheels of tomorrow, you still wander the fields of your sorrow." It is a line that feels today uncomfortably accurate, for it seems that the faster we ride the wheels of tomorrow, the more we wander through the fields of anxiety, alienation, and quiet despair. With the rapid development of artificial intelligence, we have gained speed, efficiency, and, some may argue, capability. But we have also seen rising levels of stress, eco-anxiety, and a sense that human judgment is being subtly displaced rather than deeply supported. Which brings us back to a much older question. Writing in The Guardian in December 2025, Joseph de Weck reminds us that Immanuel Kant defined the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. For Kant, immaturity was the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. In Kant's time, that other, as de Weck reminds us, was the priest, the monarch, the feudal lord. Today, the question is harder to ignore. Has that other become the machine? So perhaps the question is not whether machines are becoming more intelligent, but whether we are practicing intelligence less collectively, less critically, less ethically. And if that is the case, what does it mean to reimagine intelligence in an age of artificial intelligence? And what is the role of education in ensuring that progress does not come at the cost of judgment, responsibility, and human maturity? Welcome to React, Reimagining Education in the Age of Crises and Transitions, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute. I'm Raphael Costambeys-Kempczynski. Across this series, we explore how education is being called upon to transform in response to a world shaped by polycrisis, from democracy and planetary well-being to global engagement, learning for hope, and the future of knowledge itself. In this episode, Reimagining Intelligence, we ask, what kinds of intelligence should education now be cultivating? And what kinds it may have neglected, not just cognitive performance, but collective judgment, not just technical skill, but ethical discernment, not just speed, but wisdom. My guests today bring poly-perspectives to the poly-crisis. Iona Galleron is Vice President for Teaching and Learning at Sorbonne Nouvelle and Professor in the Digital Humanities, who has long engaged with questions of knowledge, critical thought, and academic training. Iona, welcome. Much of today's debate around intelligence is dominated by metrics, performance, and computation. From your perspective in the humanities, and perhaps, of course, as your responsibilities regarding teaching and learning at the university, Sorbonne Nouvelle, what gets lost when intelligence is reduced to speed, to output or optimization? And what should universities be defending more forcefully?
Thank you for our question, Raphael. In many ways, the reduction of intelligence to speed is not new in academia. I mean, it has been there for years, and it's not really linked, to my sense, to the generative AI that we are knowing right now. It has been the rule in academia for decades to publish or perish, for instance. Recruitment of the staff. I have seen over 30 years how at the beginning we were recruiting students, doctoral students with one or two publications, and now we are expecting from them to publish massively while they are just still learning how to do research. You mentioned very quickly the impact factors that are everywhere, and they have been here largely before the artificial intelligence. They were here, they were dominating the market during the winter of the artificial intelligence. So everything has been here already. Another problem we have, or maybe not a problem, but which explains why we are going faster and faster and we lose intelligence in the matter, is the massification of the access to the higher education. When you have thousands of students that you must graduate because they cannot stay in the university forever, they need to find jobs, they need to support themselves. In that case, well, you have another problem. You need to be more efficient, so go faster on sacrificing something else. And what we are sacrificing is time, the time we can give the students. So the result, to me, it's quite terrible what I am seeing, and probably it's valid everywhere, is the divide between teaching and learning. Universities have been thought as places where research informs teaching, but actually teaching becomes an activity on itself, and very often is not performed anymore by the very professors that are doing the research. Those professors are staying in their ivory towers doing the research, and very, very little, very, very seldom they engage with students, and they expect students with a very high level of maturity. But what happens at the first levels when the students are coming into university is very often left to the teaching of people that we are hiring from outside the university, even from outside academia. So there is this divide. I have seen in the French academia something that I'd never thought possible, to have people saying, oh, he's just a teacher, he or she is just a teacher. We are all supposed to do research and teaching, but in some cases there is a form of disdain for the good teacher, for the one who actually really engage with the students. So I think that the major cost, is that both in research and in teaching, we actually teach and value reproducibility. It's easier, it's faster to write a paper that actually kind of replicates another one, even if it brings a small contribution somewhere. And there, the artificial intelligence will very much help, because it has this ability to kind of create something new without being new. So I can just use it to create fake papers out of a very little body of research. In teaching, is the same. What we are looking, because we have major number of students, is their capacity. We are looking at their capacity of reproducing a discourse that we are serving them. I don't really have any more time to teach disruption, to teach ethics, to teach responsibility, because we are going faster and faster. I am not at all pessimistic, because I can also see within academia trends that go against this reality. You are probably aware about the coalition to reform research evaluation. It gains momentum. It touches more and more institutions. Sometimes I'm a bit scared that it will be only a hype movement to say that my university, my institution adheres to Quora principles, but actually we are still looking at the impact factor and everything. But still, it is there and it is significant. What should universities defend? Because this is your main question. I think the universities should defend the time for the students, the time for the professors, the time for the researchers to build their research. I'd like to think to the title of a novel, La faculté de l'inutile, it comes to me in French, the faculty of the inutility by Dombrowski. And yes, we must give some place to the what is not immediately usable in our lives, in our curricula, in our building. We need to defend time. We need to defend the time for everybody to build himself or herself.
Thank you very much, Iona Galleron, for that response. And there's a couple of things I think we'll probably come back to during our conversation. I've also heard the sort of distinction that you pinpoint there between teachers and professionals, as if teaching isn't a profession in itself; it's something else. There's an underlying issue, I think, in your response, and that's the question of competition. Publish and perish is a competition, and as it filters down through the different levels of learning to the doctoral level, and sometimes even the master's level, we see today sometimes master's students are pushed towards publishing. Is it a question of competition? And if so, what are we competing for? But I'm sure we'll come back to that issue later on in the conversation. We are also joined by Ritesh Shah, professor at the University of Auckland and a leading voice on education in contexts of conflict, displacement, and inequality. Ritesh, welcome. Thank you for joining us, because may I remind our listeners that our speakers are from all over the world. So we are recording this with various remote devices. And Ritesh, I'm in Paris. You're somewhere in New Zealand, perhaps?
Yeah, in Auckland, in the North Island.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ritesh, your work reminds us that intelligence is never abstract. It is practiced under conditions of pressure, moral choice, and constraint. And some of these issues, of course, Iona has just touched upon. In context of crisis and displacement, what forms of intelligence do you see become visible that formal education systems often fail to recognize or value?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was reflecting on what Iona was saying, but also, some of my prior experiences. And I go back to the work of Antonio Gramsci and this idea of the organic intellectual. And I've often reflected on the important role, for instance, that educators play in a time of crisis. And a lot of my research has looked at that in a range of different contexts. And what I see kind of emerge in those periods are kind of three things. One is a sense of what I call political intelligence, an awareness of one's location in the kind of local politics of one's environment, but also the wider politics that one finds themselves in. And one of the things I've seen in education, and we're seeing this very acutely now, and I think education systems around the world, is on one hand, detachment of the seeming detachment of politics from education, but how politics is really imbued across education, and yet we deny it. And I think in a context of crisis, that type of political intelligence, which where for instance teachers are supposed to be apolitical, and this idea that you're not supposed to express one's political views and ideologies, I mean, those things become so important and necessary and critical to the way that communities value the role of education in such time. The second form of intelligence that I think is really important is emotional intelligence. It's this idea of how do you understand and kind of reconcile a range of different emotions that you might be feeling at once: anger, grief, trauma, hope, resilience. These are not binaries. They're all being felt at the same time, and there is a need to kind of make sense of that and think about how do you use that intelligence of your own emotions, both individually and collectively, to harness that towards something that is reparative rather than harmful. And I think that type of intelligence is oftentimes not looked at or looked at in the way that I think it should be in times of conflict and crisis. And then the third type of intelligence that I think is really critical, and this is where I think technology will never replace human intelligence, is what I call relational intelligence. And that is the way that we connect to others. And one of the things that I've observed from my own position in the university and the way that we're being kind of invoked to kind of use technology in our teaching and learning practices is the fact that it divorces students from each others. It divorces the educator from the students. It atomizes the process of learning, and in the end, the concept of pedagogy and the concept of learning is a relational process. It's about how we engage with each other in a process of making sense of the world around us. And that relational intelligence in a time of crisis and conflict is even more important. So, as I said, political intelligence, emotional intelligence, and relational intelligence, I don't think our formal education systems and higher education institutions do enough in that regard at the moment.
Thank you very much, Ritesh. And yeah, so political intelligence and relational intelligence are two forms of intelligence that I didn't list in my introduction. But I'm touched by this, what you mentioned about the fact that the act of teaching is often understood to be something that should be apolitical. But at the same time, of course, we understand that everything is political. It's not partisan politics, but these notions of interacting forces, even in, of course, an educational context, and perhaps, sometimes it's even more symptomatic in an educational context, are things that need to be understood and comprehended. Thank you very much for your answer. And finally, I'd like to welcome François TADDEI, co-founder of the Learning Planet Institute and a long-standing advocate for collective intelligence and learning ecosystems designed for a rapidly changing world. And I should say, really co-designed intergenerationally. François, welcome. You've often argued that the intelligence we need most today is precisely the one we have least practiced. In an age of artificial intelligence, then, what forms of human and collective intelligence do you think should education be prioritizing, and why? And if you'll allow me to do so, I'm going to tie in also this issue of competition that was underlying some of the responses that Iona offered us a few minutes ago. When we are working on questions of intelligence and knowledge acquisition, you have spoken about not forming students to be the best in the world, but the best for the world, which I think also changes the dynamics of this competition, perhaps, that we are evoking. So there's a double question there for you.
Thanks, and thanks for all the intro and the nice contributions so far. So clearly, we are in this hyper competition mode. The students feel the pressure very much. They compete for grades and honors and all sorts of things that will enable them to go to the best possible places for them, either within academia or in terms of job markets and so on. So clearly, we are in that very competitive framework. And what I learn from biology, biology is a place where definitely there is competition, but there is also a lot of cooperation. And cooperation and competition, are often seen as antagonistic, but they are sometimes embedded. Sometimes people talk about co-opetition, where collectives compete with other collectives, for instance. And that's, you could see a cell as a collective molecule, an individual as a collective of cells, and the community as a collective of individuals, and nations as collective competing with one another. But ultimately, we have only one planet. So that planet is not competing with anyone. And, it was so far supporting our competition, but progressively, because we compete so much to optimize whatever metrics of the past, we tend to consume everything else at the service of that competition. including natural resource, including, our mental well-being, including, social welfare, including, the ability to collectively live peacefully on a planet with limited resource. So I think we have to shift from this sort of monodimensional competition to a sort of a cooperation to be the best versions of ourselves for the world. And we need to learn this, the earlier the better. So you can start already, in kindergarten, some of these activities, and even younger, but you can certainly do it within university. So university could be a place where you learn to cooperate, to do something together that you cannot do alone. Should be a place where, you learn to use different tools, methods, disciplines, but also your own resource and the resources of the world around you, which could include, some digital resources these days and technologies. But, you can also see the collective to which you belong as some sort of a resource that you can activate. So you have to learn your individual agency and the collective agency, asking, what it is that you can do together that you could not do alone, so that you can face the challenges that you have as an individual, but that the collective has, and that actually, the whole planet starts feeling ever more. And that ability to understand the dynamics of the world. So you have to understand where we come from to better understand where we are and better understand where we could be going. That may not be the dominant narratives. And you have to understand that your intelligence and your dynamics are embedded within what can be called evolutionary fruitful frame of freedom. So whatever you do, there is a frame around you. If anything, the laws of physics, but there is, the walls and the budgets and sometimes the laws of humans that are imposed on you. But there is always some degrees of freedom. Even in the worst dictators, you have some degrees of freedom internally, so you can use your brain to explore dimensions that no one knows about. But in any classroom, for instance, you have some frames of freedoms, and you can start using those to do something that is as fruitful as possible for the time and age that you're facing. And what I think is important is to understand those frames and those degrees of freedom and see that they've always evolved since the Big Bang and, throughout human history and throughout biological evolution. And so that you can maybe change some of the degrees of freedom, and maybe even the whole frame can be redefined. So you can go from a frame of hyper-competition for grades to a frame of cooperation for meaningful impact, where you're invited to contribute to the planetary commons. And for me, the planetary commons go in three different complementary threads. There is those that pre-existed humans and that we interact with, like the climate, biodiversity, quality of air, quality of water, and so on. And there is human-made commons, typically intellectual commons, democracy, arts, culture, science. And more recently, we've created a subcategory of those, which is are the digital commons. You can think of the web, you can think of open source software, you can think of Wikipedia. That is clearly a hybrid between what human-made and something very digital. And so all those can be privatized, can be polluted, quality of information versus fake news, for instance, the quality of air versus pollution, etc. You have, therefore, what's called a tragedy of the common. If no one takes care of the common, they are going to be destroyed, polluted, they're going to disappear. And because they are the founding metrics of everything we do, then, our health as individual, as collective, and even as a species may, dwindle and even, go to extinction. And that ability to self-destroy, for me was pretty obvious this very summer when I was in Nagasaki for the 80th anniversary. And I really felt that humans have created the tools of their own demise. You talk about Frankenstein in your introduction, and clearly we keep inventing ways that were dreamed initially. The same way the doctor had, dreams that turned into nightmare. I think Einstein and Marie Curie had beautiful dreams of understanding the physics of atoms and energy, and it all turned into one of the worst nightmares. So, we all discuss ethics briefly, but I think that unless we become more ethical, we are so more powerful than our ancestors were, that we still have that basic emotional background that can be hijacked very easily by technology and can turn us into mobs or into weapons of mass destruction to our own species. And so that's why I believe that ethics, in the sense of understanding our vulnerability, of understanding our cross vulnerability, and what distinguishes us from any other animal species, and certainly all the machines we create, is that we are the most vulnerable at birth. And that vulnerability is deeply entrenched, and understanding that vulnerability and the need, therefore, to have a village to raise a kid and to have a community to think about our future, I think is really important. And so we have to, if we don't want to go for these nightmares, we have to find a way to dream, tell the nightmares and the dreams we have, and find a path that I call ethical dream weaving, which is a path where you find a way to make your dream come true without creating nightmare neither for yourself nor for others, neither for today nor for tomorrow, neither for our species nor ideally for other species.
Thank you very much, François. And the dynamics that you mention here between competition and cooperation, the dynamics between individual agency and collective agency, for me, tie back into what Ritesh was talking about in forms of relational intelligence. I don't know if, Ritesh, for you, that is an echo that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this idea of interdependence and connectivity, I think, is so critical to us making sense of our world around us, our communities, our place in society. And I was also reflecting on something Iona was saying before around, what the other side, the demands, and the word I wrote down was performativity. There's a certain performativity that is being enacted, I feel, across the education landscape at present, that kind of inhibits this kind of approach to interdependence and connectivity, and we need to kind of call out that performativity and that culture of performativity.
Thank you. So, Iona, you are our representative of university governance. So, for you then, how has the university, as if there is sort of like one, not there isn't one monolithic university, of course, each university has its own personality, but how do you see perhaps the meaning of intelligence, or the poly meanings of intelligence that we've started to weave together, to borrow a term from François, around this notion of intelligence? How have you seen that shift perhaps inside the university over the past few years, dare I say decades? I'm thinking here, some of what you were describing earlier sort of threw me back to my own student days, 30 plus years ago. And I'm thinking to myself, have things really not? The world has changed so much, and yet if the academic system hasn't changed, hasn't managed to follow at the same speed, dare I say, those evolutions, what's going on?
Well, I'm afraid I will disappoint you, because I was reflecting upon intelligence. I was trying to remember when is the last time I heard a colleague talking about student intelligence or intelligence at all. And it may be interesting to do with a, you know, computer linguistic approach, but I'm afraid that in France we don't use the word intelligence very much. And I'm even afraid that it's not equality anymore that we are looking for in students. I mean, I have in mind colleagues talking about the fact that we are saying this student is not stupid. Okay. But when we say he's not stupid, it rather means that he or she has the ability of cheating without being caught. We are not looking at that as an intelligent way of optimizing one's time or whatever. It's even, I mean, it goes against the system, and it's complicated to deal with, because we are much happier with students that comply with what we are asking to them, even if they are not maybe what a few decades ago we would say intelligence. So intelligent. I'm afraid that this what changed a lot. We are not looking for the best brains. We are looking for the brains that are the most able to comply with a model of learning that is deeply ingrained into our habits and that keeps us safe into a comfort zone where we know what we have to do. But to trace back to a little bit to what you said about competition and cooperation. On the other hand, I'm very much afraid that one of the problems we have is that the students are, yeah, you said that they are competing to go to the best university. And what they are doing there once they are there. I'm seeing students that compete to go to the best university, to the best class, to the everything. And actually they don't attend, in very many cases, they don't attend those classes. And it's okay, I'm fine. I have been a student myself, and sometimes you fancy more going to see a movie or for a walk than going to to listen to your professor, to your teachers. This is part of the student's life, but still, I think that what we have lost, and maybe that's what changed the most in academia in relation with intelligence, is the idea that what those students benefits from coming to the university is, I was speaking before about time. What my students don't often realize that I'm giving them some of my time, and they should use it because my time is limited, and what they can learn in interaction with me and what I can learn in interaction with them, it's a one-shot thing that happens in a space and time. I'm afraid I don't. Maybe this is the intelligence that we do not develop enough. The realization of the fact that every interaction is unique and can bring you something, and it can allow you to bring something back to the world. So that's, yeah, I'm very much in agreement with the fact that unfortunately competition is the main word instead of cooperation. I am looking at the images that we are filling the head of our adolescents with. I think that the movie that is most specific of how we are bringing our people, our young people to see the world is the Hunger Games. The world is a Hunger Games where everybody competes for resources. And this is it. And we don't see precisely that. No, it doesn't have to be like that. And maybe I'm a bit nostalgic and bad. I'm coming from a communist country, a very dictatorial country, but still, I was raised within a discourse that said, you are the future. You, the young people, are the future. The world is not going very well, but you will find a solution to make it go further. And this is what I'm afraid that got lost in academia. Is rather the discourse, you are doomed, you are not good enough, you are not liking effort enough to compete and to be at the level that is demanded from you. The world is crushing, everything goes back badly. So that's
Yeah.
what I think we lost. Sorry, I've been a bit long.
You've mentioned the time factor on several occasions, and time itself, of course, is a resource that we're all competing for. We're having this conversation early January 2026, and today I was listening to a report earlier on about the primary age reading gap in the UK. More and more children are leaving primary school unable to read. And this has been correlated to competition for time because there are more and more distractions, not just for the children themselves, but of course for the parents as well. So parents are spending less time reading with their children, and children have less time learning how to read. And this is therefore having an impact on secondary education, etc., and simply for an impact on the growing autonomy and ability of the children, their agency, future agency, choosing what they want to read in the future, how they want to learn, what they want to learn, and we can see the repercussions. And François mentioned framework. Iona, you just mentioned this idea that we add value to students who comply. Ritesh, if we come back to you, you work in contexts where intelligence is practiced under conditions of constraint. So that's another another term there that fits in that same family with framework and comply. So intelligence here is practiced under conditions of constraint, violence, and displacement. So for you, where do current efforts fail to harness the types of intelligence you described? Relational intelligence, political intelligence. And maybe, can you explain to us why efforts have failed around harnessing these different types of intelligence?
Yeah, I think the example I would give that would probably relate to everyone can kind of connect to this, is the narrative that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. And if we go back to that time, the narrative we heard quickly come up was this notion of learning loss. We were worried about the what students would miss out on because they were not in education, and the narrative was largely spun by actors and agencies like the World Bank, and they were linking that to economic loss and economic productivity losses. And so, reflecting on some of the conversations we've had already, I was thinking that I think one of the things that why this discourse of competition has kind of fed so heavily into the education landscape today is because so much of education is wrapped up in this notion of individual social mobility. And this is something we see as well, even in context of crisis and conflict. And in fact, in some ways, it's even more acute because, on one hand, for those who are seen to be successful, it offers a way out of such conditions. It offers a ticket, the golden ticket, the promise of a better life. Um, on the flip side, though, the reality is for 99.9%, that is a fiction, right? And we continue to perpetuate this fiction of, if you gain a credential, you'll get a good paying job, that you'll, be economically successful. And it links back to what Iona talked about before, the massification of education. These dynamics are very, very harmful, I think, particularly in a context of conflict and crisis, because what you need most importantly in such settings is a place where learners along with educators are able to take risk, are able to challenge the status quo, are able to think about, kind of as Francois talked about, the collective agency of what it means to harness, disparate experiences and work towards something productive. And my fear is that so much of this narrative of learning loss, of the knowledge economy, of social mobility, it works against all of these other set of values.
Yeah. So, all right, Francois, let's bring you back in at this point then, because you've long argued that intelligence, as Ritesh has just reminded us, is not a property of individuals, but an emergent collective capacity. And you spoke earlier, indeed, about collective agency. And I'm going to add into this the fact that you've recently co-authored a report for the French government on artificial intelligence in higher education. So tell us, what are we getting wrong? What's the solution to this?
I think that hyper competition is what we're getting wrong, and that we have to learn to cooperate at all scales for not only the sake of our students and the sake of our university, but also for the sake of our planet and the sake of our humanity. And I think that's what would be. So we need a redesign, and we need some sort of instead of competing within the frames that currently exist and that force us to compete, whether we want it or not. We need to redefine the frames so that we can make them cooperative. I've studied bacterial cooperation. Bacteria can cooperate or compete, and there is some circumstances under which cooperation is favored, others under which competition is favored, and so clearly we created conditions where competition is overwhelming favored, and that leads to all sorts of the issues that we've been discussing. So we need to redefine that frame to facilitate cooperation. So, for instance, can we define what a planetary diploma would be, where students that want to align to the planetary long-term needs and want to make a difference could learn to cooperate, to be that best versions of themselves for the world, rather than trying to compete in this best in the world contest. And the best way to do it, and we've started to do it at a local scale, but now that we work with UNESCO and the UN University, I think it's time to open that question at a broader scale. We can invite students to co-create the diploma. To take the words of one of the students I heard, interestingly, at the General Assembly of the UN, when the member states, all of them, were about to sign the Pact for the Future. And the Pact for the Future says we should take no decision that are not in the best interest of future generation. And everyone agrees, at least in theory. And yet, we are still trapped in our competing logic, and we are not delivering on that intent. So what that student was arguing for, she was saying, I want to learn to be the change I want to see in the world. And so if she wants to learn this, then we have to co-create with her and her generation the frame, the evolving fruitful frame of freedom that would be enabling them to learn to be the change they want to see in the world. And so we have to co-create with them. And so, for instance, you can invite students to co-design what a planetary doctorate would be, and how different would that be from the PhD that already exists. And if you can do it for the PhD, you can do it for the master, you can do it for the bachelor, you can even do it for the baccalaureate. And as we speak, I have very inspiring conversations with young people that want to co-design those very diploma because they want to make a difference. And they realize that they've understood enough of the system to see that it traps them in logics that force them to compete when they would need to cooperate, force them to think about grades when they want to think about what's meaningful and what's impactful, and how to be a good ancestor rather than, be transiently somewhat successful in the current rule of the games. So it's inviting students to understand that there are rules of games, and that, they can contribute to redesign them. And what's interesting is that it's not only students arguing for this. OECD, for instance, and UNESCO, which are defining, some of the frames and have evolved some of the frame in the last decades, start to realize that, you need greening education, you need education for human flourishing, you need education in the age of AI that foster the very 21st century skills and human capabilities that are needed to face a fast-changing world. And what's interesting is that lots of what we call 21st century skills are actually Homo sapiens sapiens skills since the very beginning. Compassion, cooperation, ability to do something together that you cannot do alone, ability to care for each other and for your community is something that, we would not have been able to survive our past if we didn't develop those skills. And if we call them now 21st century skill, it's just that since 19th century and especially 20th century, we tended to forget them. And we, said, this is at best informal education that you can learn with scouts or others. Okay. But, those are the core things that distinguish us from machines. And those are the core things that distinguish us from every other animal and made us successful until we, define this rules of the game of today that we see as eternal, whereas they were not. They were created by humans for different reasons during Industrial Revolution, and we have to reframe those rules to go back to our roots on one side and invent our future together. And so that's this reframing of purpose of education that I think is important. So basically, the Sustainable Developmental Goal defined by the UN are some sort of planetary compass, if you want. Okay, so how do you learn to align to that planetary compass as individual, but also as collectives, and therefore as institution? Are you a university that is aligned for, the competition, say in Shanghai ranking, which clearly is something very artificial? Some people in Shanghai decided, these were the criteria, or are you there to redefine the very framework in which you operate so that you serve your students' best interest and you serve your community best interest and you serve our species best interest and our planet best interest. And so, aligning to this is something that is possible because we have that SDG framework defined as planetary compass. We have individual students that want to go there. And it's for us to align to that big things. And lots of people talk about planetary alignment as if planets were aligned. No, planetary alignment is aligning to the planetary needs. Okay. And if we all do this, then it becomes much more meaningful and possible to co-design the future we need.
Thank you very much, François. We're slowly bringing this conversation to a close, but before we go, a question we ask every guest across this series. If you could return to your own student days, or indeed imagine a curriculum not yet invented, what subject would you have loved to study but never had the opportunity to? May I perhaps begin by addressing this question to you, François?
Thanks. I think I've learned recently something called moral imagination. And I like the idea because it's something that combines the ability to dream and to think forward and to develop your creativity and your ability to see the future and your place in the future. But it's adding that ethical dimension, or maybe I would call it ethical imagination rather than moral, because I prefer ethics to moral. But, I think I would love to learn to be invited to think about a future that is ethical. I mean, a future like John Rawls, where even if you had to change seats in the pecking orders of the world, you would still want that world. Okay, so how do you are able to dream of this sort of meta dream where every dream becomes compatible and no one's nightmare is met by someone's dreams? Okay, so how do you develop those skills and that ability individually and collectively? Because clearly that's not an exercise to do on your own. You have to confront your dreams to the nightmares of others, and you have to confront their dreams to your own nightmares, and you have to learn to weave those. And I think that's something which, I wish I had learned earlier, and I wish, I can still learn today. And I wish, the future generation can learn to do much better than, what I could articulate.
Thank you, François. And if I could address the same question to you, Ritesh.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I was reflecting back on my undergraduate days. And I did an interdisciplinary major in the 1990s at Stanford University, which at that time I didn't realize how revolutionary it was, but it was talking about what they called Earth systems. And it
Wow.
brought together the philosophy, the science, the economics, and the policy all together and had us think about ecosystem science and thinking. And so I appreciate that education, but there was another complementary major, which I didn't do, which I wish I had done, which was called Science, Technology, and Society. And the reason I would think about that program is because I think increasingly we need to be critically aware of the kind of philosophical, moral, ethical dimensions of how science and technology are not these neutral, positive, progressive forces always, and that we need to kind of disentangle it. It goes back, I think, to what François was talking about. With the Einstein and some of the earlier ideas of scientific discovery, and we treat them as kind of always positive. But what are the ethical and moral implications of these kind of monsters we create that sometimes we then don't know how to put back in the box? And so this is something I'd love to go back and think more about.
Thank you very much, Ritesh. And finally, if I could put the question to you, Iona.
Well, I will answer very shortly and very longly in the same time. The short answer is I would have liked to do some astronomy, astrophysics, because I would
Okay.
like to meet green people coming from another planet. Not because the world is not enough, but because I think there are other forms of intelligence out there, and we would learn very much from them. But the longer answer is that I would probably like not to start studying. And I think this also answers another question you haven't asked. What would I change in academia? I think that we are pushing our youngest to go too fast into university studies, university careers. And actually, they really, in very many cases, they don't know actually what they want. I dream about a system where it is mandatory to have 1 year of gap between your secondary school education and the higher education. I know it comes in the form of what we call in France année de césure, but it's still very clumsy and we really don't get out the most of it. The idea being that maybe tomorrow, at least in France, I hope we will not hire students, we will not take students anymore because they have very good marks. Those are important. Good marks are important. This is not the problem, but it creates this competition. But we should be able to select them because they spent a year engaging with the others, traveling, doing something that is meaningful to them. And they should come and tell us, this has been meaningful to me because of this. And that to me would be a very good indicator about what they are good at and where they could really succeed. Not this, go and do your university studies because this is what everybody does, and you will have, if you don't have a diploma, you will not have a job. You will not get fulfilled as a person.
Thank
So
you
I
very
think this is something I would have done myself.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And I can relate to that equally. So thank you, Iona Galleron. Thank you, Ritesh Shah. And thank you, François TADDEI, for having joined us for this conversation. You've been listening to React, Reimagining Education in the Age of Crises and Transitions, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute, recorded as part of the Learning Planet Festival in celebration of International Day of Education. My thanks go to our guests, of course, and to you for listening. I'm Raphael Costambeys-Kempczynski. Thank you for joining us in this continuing experiment in hope. And a special thank you to our production team, Etienne Carlen, Maria Angelica Mejia Caceres, and Edouard Picard, for bringing these conversations to life.
Learning Planet Institute.